When I collapsed in the hospital lobby, my doctor walked past me and said, "Still performing, I see." I was on the floor, unable to move my legs, and he stepped over me like I was trash while nurses rushed to help. "Get her to emergency," one nurse shouted, but Dr. Brennan held up his hand. "She's my patient." This is attention-seeking behavior. She does this whenever she doesn't get pain medication. The nurses looked confused because I'd never asked for pain medication, just answers for why I couldn't walk some days. "Sir, she can't move her legs." The younger nurse was checking my reflexes and looking worried. "She can move them fine. I've seen her walk. This morning she walked into my office, didn't she?" He pulled out his phone, checking the time like I was making him late. "That was 3 hours ago. Something's wrong. Please run the MRI you promised." I could barely talk through the pain shooting up my spine. "I never promised an MRI. You demanded one because you've been reading medical websites." He turned to the nurses. "Leave her. She'll get up when she realizes nobody's buying her act." But the older nurse wasn't having it. "Doctor, with respect, we can't leave a patient on the floor." He laughed, and it was cruel. "Patient?" "She's a frequent flyer who wants disability checks. I've seen dozens like her. Mysterious pain that conveniently flares up when bills are due." I tried to sit up but couldn't. "I work full-time. I don't want disability. I want to know what's wrong with me." He rolled his eyes and pulled my chart up on his tablet. "According to my notes, you've complained about back pain, leg numbness, and weakness for 8 months. Every test came back normal. Therefore, you're fine." The younger nurse was still checking my reflexes. "Doctor, her left foot has no response, 0 plantar reflex." He didn't even look. "She's controlling it." They learned to suppress reflexes from YouTube videos. That's when my husband arrived for what was supposed to be my follow-up appointment. "What's happening? Why is my wife on the floor?" Dr. Brennan sighed dramatically. "Your wife is having another episode. I was just explaining to the staff that this is behavioral, not medical." My husband's face went red. "Behavioral?" "She woke up crying in pain. She crawled to the bathroom this morning because her legs wouldn't work." The doctor smirked. "Yet she managed to get here, didn't she?" Interesting how the paralysis comes and goes. The older nurse was taking my blood pressure and frowned. "Her BP is 180/95. That's not behavioral." Dr. Brennan waved dismissively. "Anxiety from being caught faking." That's when another doctor walked by and stopped. "What's going on here?" The nurse explained while Dr. Brennan tried to interrupt. "I'm handling this. She's my patient." But the other doctor was already kneeling beside me. "Can you feel this?" He pressed on my legs and I felt nothing below my knees. "No. Nothing. It's been getting worse for months, but Dr. Brennan says I'm imagining it." The new doctor looked at my chart, then at Dr. Brennan. "You haven't ordered any imaging? No MRI? No CT scan? With progressive numbness and paralysis?" Dr. Brennan crossed his arms. "The blood work was normal. No need for expensive tests for psychosomatic symptoms." The new doctor stood up slowly. "Get her to radiology immediately. Full spine MRI with contrast." He looked at Dr. Brennan. "And you come with me." The nurses lifted me onto a gurney while my husband held my hand. 2 hours later, the new doctor came back with the MRI results and the head of neurology. "You have a tumor compressing your spinal cord. It's been growing for months. Another week and the damage would have been permanent." He turned to my husband. "She needs surgery tonight." I started crying not from pain but from relief that someone finally believed me. Dr. Brennan said I was faking. The head of neurology looked furious. "Dr. Brennan is being reviewed. Refusing to order basic imaging for progressive neurological symptoms is malpractice." The surgery took 6 hours. When I woke up, I could feel my legs again. The surgeon said if we'd waited another week, I would have been paralyzed for life. The tumor was benign, but had been growing exactly where I'd been telling Dr. Brennan the pain was for 8 months. 3 days later, while I was still recovering, the hospital administrator came to my room. "Dr. Brennan is no longer employed here. We've reviewed his other cases and found a pattern of dismissing female patients with chronic pain. 17 women with serious conditions he labeled as drug-seeking or hypochondriacs." She handed me a card. "The hospital will cover all your medical expenses and ongoing treatment. We're also recommending you speak to our legal department." My husband looked at the administrator. "How many of those 17 women ended up with permanent damage?" She looked at my husband for a second, then back at me. Her face showed she didn't want to answer that question. She cleared her throat and adjusted the folder in her hands. My husband squeezed my hand harder and said the number again, slower this time, like maybe he heard wrong. 17. You said 17 women. The administrator nodded and confirmed it. The hospital went through Dr. Brennan's files from the past 3 years after my emergency surgery made them look closer at his work. They found 17 cases where he refused to order basic tests for women who came to him with ongoing pain and other symptoms. Those women went to different doctors later and got diagnosed with real medical problems. Some of them have damage that won't ever get better because of how long they waited for treatment. I felt my stomach drop. The room got too hot and too small. I kept thinking about how I almost ended up paralyzed forever, and someone only helped me because another doctor happened to walk by at the right moment. My husband's voice got louder when he asked what happened to those other women, and if the hospital told them about Dr. Brennan getting fired. The administrator said they're contacting everyone who was affected. They want to offer support and let people know they can talk to lawyers if they want to. She pulled out a business card and handed it to my husband, since my hands were shaking too much to hold anything. The card had information for the hospital's patient helper, and also a lawyer who handles medical cases. She said we could pick our own lawyer if we wanted, but they thought this one might be good to talk to. After she left, my husband and I just sat there not saying anything. I should have felt better knowing Dr. Brennan was gone and couldn't hurt anyone else. But instead, I felt sick thinking about all those women who suffered because nobody stopped him sooner. My husband got up and paced around the small hospital room. He kept running his hands through his hair, which is what he does when he's trying not to lose it completely. I watched the IV drip slowly into my arm and wondered how many of those 17 women were sitting in the hospital rooms right now, dealing with problems that could have been caught early. How many of them lost their jobs because they were too sick to work? How many had people stop believing them, just like Dr. Brennan didn't believe me? Later that night, the head of neurology came by to check on me. He had my chart with him and sat down in the chair next to my bed. He explained that I needed to be really careful with movement for the next 6 weeks. No lifting anything heavy, no twisting my back, no sudden movements. After that, I'd start physical therapy to get my strength back. He said the tumor was not cancer, which was good, but it had been growing for at least a year based on what they saw in the imaging. Maybe longer. I asked him straight out if he looked at Dr. Brennan's notes in my file before the surgery. He stopped writing and looked up at me. He said yes, he read through everything. The lack of any diagnostic work was alarming given how clear my symptoms were in the notes. 8 months of appointments where I described the same progressive problems, and Dr. Brennan never ordered a single imaging test. My husband leaned forward in his chair. He asked why nobody caught this pattern earlier if there were 17 women going through the same thing. The neurology chief looked uncomfortable. He explained that complaints about Dr. Brennan went to different departments over the years. Nobody put them all together in one place until after my emergency surgery made them do a complete review of his cases. The system failed, he said, and he was sorry. But sorry didn't help the women who were already hurt. That night I couldn't sleep even though the pain medication should have knocked me out. I kept thinking about those other women. Were some of them dealing with permanent damage like the administrator said? Did they lose their jobs because they couldn't work while they were sick? Did their families stop believing them when doctor after doctor said nothing was wrong? Were some of them still out there right now, being told by other doctors that their pain was all in their heads? The thoughts kept spinning around and around until the nurse came in at 2 a.m. to check my vitals and found me crying. The next morning, a woman from patient services came to visit. She introduced herself as the patient advocate and said she was there to help me understand what support the hospital could offer. She was nice enough, but I could tell she was reading from a script someone gave her. She talked about therapy services and financial help with medical bills. She said the hospital took these situations very seriously and wanted to make sure I had everything I needed for my recovery. But she was careful not to say the hospital did anything wrong beyond what Dr. Brennan did on his own. Like he was one bad apple and the rest of the hospital had no idea what was happening. I asked the patient advocate if she could give me contact information for the other 17 women. She shook her head and explained that privacy rules meant she couldn't share their information without permission, but she could pass along my contact details to them if they wanted to reach out. I understood the rules but felt frustrated because I needed to talk to someone who'd been through what I was going through. My husband squeezed my hand and said we'd figure it out together, but I could tell he was frustrated too. The advocate left after giving me paperwork about support services and victim resources, most of it focused on therapy rather than practical help connecting with other patients. After she left, my husband pulled out his phone and called the attorney the hospital recommended. Jerome Lambert answered on the second ring and listened while my husband explained what happened to me. Jerome said he could meet with us once I was discharged and asked a few questions about my symptoms and Dr. Brennan's refusal to order tests. Then he said something that made both of us sit up straighter. He'd already been contacted by 3 other women from Dr. Brennan's patient list, and he was seeing a clear pattern of medical negligence. My husband put the phone on speaker so I could hear, and Jerome explained that pattern cases like this were stronger than individual malpractice claims because they showed ongoing behavior rather than a single mistake. He said we'd talk more after I got home, but he wanted us to know he was taking this seriously. The next morning, a woman in scrubs knocked on my door and introduced herself as Grace Henderson, my physical therapist. She had a warm smile but serious eyes, and she explained we'd start with basic movement exercises to prevent my muscles from getting weaker while I recovered. She helped me sit up in bed and showed me how to flex my feet and bend my knees without putting stress on my spine. The exercises seemed simple, but I could tell from how carefully she watched me that she'd seen the imaging showing nerve damage. She didn't say anything about it directly, just adjusted my movements and made notes on her tablet. After 20 minutes, my legs were shaking from the effort of movements that used to be automatic. Grace came back that afternoon for another session, and this time she was more direct. She sat down next to the bed and told me I should regain most of my strength and mobility, but some numbness in my left foot would likely be permanent. The nerve had been compressed for too long before the surgery, and that kind of damage didn't always heal completely. I felt anger flare up hot in my chest because this was exactly what I'd been afraid of when I kept asking Dr. Brennan for tests. If he'd ordered the MRI 8 months ago when I first requested it, the tumor would have been smaller, and the nerve wouldn't have been damaged. Grace saw my face change and handed me a tissue, then said something that made me cry harder. She said she was sorry this happened to me, and she'd seen too many patients who came to her with preventable injuries because doctors didn't listen. 5 days after surgery, the head of neurology cleared me for discharge. He went over strict instructions about movement restrictions for the next 6 weeks. No lifting anything heavier than 5 pounds, no twisting my back, no bending at the waist. He prescribed pain medication and muscle relaxers and scheduled follow-up appointments for 2 weeks and 6 weeks out. My husband had been home the day before to set up our guest room on the ground floor so I wouldn't have to deal with stairs. He'd moved a bed down from upstairs, cleared out space for my clothes, and set up a small table next to the bed with my phone charger and water bottles. When we got home, he helped me walk slowly from the car to the house, and I felt exhausted just from that short distance. The first week home was harder than I expected. I was grateful to be in my own space instead of the hospital, but every simple task reminded me how much I'd lost. Getting dressed took 20 minutes because I couldn't bend down to put on socks or pants without help. Walking to the bathroom required concentration because my left foot was still numb and I had to watch where I placed it. Taking a shower meant sitting on a plastic chair my husband bought because standing was too tiring. Every time I struggled with something I used to do without thinking, I pictured Dr. Brennan's face when he told me I was faking, and the anger would burn through me again. My husband tried to help without hovering, but I could see the worry in his eyes every time I moved. 2 weeks after I got home, the patient advocate called to say 2 women from Dr. Brennan's patient list wanted to connect with me. Their names were Temperance Sanderson and Millicent Frazier, and they'd both agreed to a video call since I wasn't cleared for in-person meetings yet. We set it up for the following evening, and I spent the whole day nervous about what their stories would be. My husband sat next to me when I opened the laptop and 2 women appeared on screen. Temperance looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, and Millicent had her hair pulled back tight like she'd just come from work. Temperance started talking first, and her voice was quiet but steady. She'd seen Dr. Brennan for joint pain and constant tiredness for over a year. He kept telling her she was depressed and needed to exercise more, even though she explained her mother and aunt both had lupus, and she was worried about her family history. He refused to run autoimmune panels, saying her blood work looked fine and she just needed to lose weight and get more sleep. She finally went to a different doctor when her joints got so swollen she couldn't hold a pen at work. The new doctor ran the tests Dr. Brennan had refused and diagnosed her with lupus, but by then her kidneys were already damaged. Now she was on dialysis 3 times a week and might need a transplant in the next few years. Millicent's hands were clenched in her lap when she told us her story. She'd gone to Dr. Brennan for severe pain during her periods, pain so bad she'd miss work and spend days in bed. He told her cramping was normal and she needed to toughen up, maybe try yoga or meditation. She asked about endometriosis because she'd read about it online, and he laughed at her for self-diagnosing from internet research. He said if she really wanted, he could prescribe birth control to help with cramps, but surgery to check for endometriosis was unnecessary and risky. A year later, an ovarian cyst ruptured, and she ended up in emergency surgery. They found endometriosis everywhere, so much scarring that the surgeon told her she'd never be able to have children. She was 32 years old and had always wanted kids. When the call ended, I sat staring at the blank screen and started crying. My husband wrapped his arms around me, and I cried into his shoulder for what felt like hours. I kept thinking about what these women had lost because one doctor refused to take them seriously. Temperance would spend the rest of her life on dialysis unless she could get a transplant, and that was assuming her damaged kidneys didn't cause other problems. Millicent would never have biological children, and that choice had been stolen from her by someone who thought he knew better than she did about her own body. My husband held me and finally admitted he was struggling with his own anger. He'd trusted the medical system to help me, believed that doctors knew what they were doing and had patients' best interests in mind, and instead that trust had almost destroyed me. 2 weeks after my surgery, Jerome Lambert knocked on our front door carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 1,000 courtrooms. My husband let him in while I stayed on the couch, still not supposed to be walking around too much. Jerome was maybe 50 with gray at his temples, and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too many people get hurt by systems that should protect them. He sat in the chair across from me and pulled out a tablet, then looked at me for a long moment before speaking. He told me he'd been practicing medical malpractice law for 23 years, and this case made him angrier than almost anything he'd seen before. The problem with cases like mine, he explained, was that juries often didn't believe women about their pain levels or symptoms, so proving a doctor dismissed legitimate concerns could be incredibly hard. But this situation was different because Dr. Brennan had documented everything in writing, creating a paper trail that showed exactly how he'd refused to follow basic medical standards. Jerome pulled up Dr. Brennan's notes on his tablet and started reading them out loud. Entry after entry where Dr. Brennan wrote that I was drug-seeking, that my symptoms were behavioral, that I was exaggerating for attention or disability benefits. He'd written similar things about dozens of other patients, always women, always dismissing their complaints as psychological or fabricated. The notes were supposed to protect him by showing his clinical reasoning, but instead they proved he had a pattern of refusing to order standard diagnostic tests when women reported pain. Jerome had already contacted 6 of the 17 women from Dr. Brennan's patient list, and the stories were devastating. 12 of them turned out to have serious medical conditions that went undiagnosed for months or years, while Dr. Brennan told them nothing was wrong. Lupus, endometriosis, multiple sclerosis, ovarian cancer, spinal tumors, rheumatoid arthritis. 5 of those 12 women now had permanent damage or disability because their conditions progressed untreated. I asked Jerome what would happen to Dr. Brennan beyond losing his job at the hospital. Jerome set down his tablet and explained that the medical board was investigating his license and would likely revoke it permanently. Criminal charges were possible in the most severe cases where patients suffered major harm, but those were hard to prove and rarely resulted in convictions. The real accountability would come through civil malpractice lawsuits where we could force him to pay damages and make the pattern of negligence public record. My husband leaned forward and asked about the hospital's responsibility, since they'd apparently received complaints about Dr. Brennan, but didn't do anything until after my emergency surgery. Jerome's expression hardened, and he said that was exactly what interested him most about this case. The hospital created the conditions that allowed Dr. Brennan to keep dismissing female patients for years, despite multiple complaints. That institutional failure was just as important as Dr. Brennan's individual malpractice, maybe more so because it showed systemic problems. Jerome wanted to file a class action lawsuit representing all 17 women against both Dr. Brennan and the hospital. He said this approach would be much more powerful than individual cases because it would demonstrate a pattern of systemic failure rather than isolated incidents. A class action would force the hospital to examine how they handled complaints, how they supervised doctors, how they protected patients from negligent care. It would also get more media attention and public pressure for real changes. I told Jerome I wanted to be part of it, whatever he needed from me. He warned me that being a named plaintiff meant my medical records would become public, that reporters might contact me, that Dr. Brennan's lawyers would try to dig up anything they could use against me. I looked at my husband and then back at Jerome and said, I didn't care about privacy anymore. I cared about making sure this didn't happen to other women, that no one else ended up paralyzed or on dialysis or infertile because a doctor refused to believe them. Physical therapy started 3 days later in a clinic that smelled like rubber mats and cleaning solution. Grace was my therapist, a woman in her 40s with strong hands and a direct way of talking that I appreciated after months of Dr. Brennan's dismissiveness. She evaluated my range of motion and strength, testing each leg carefully while taking notes. When she finished, she told me I was doing well considering how close I'd come to permanent paralysis, but I needed to understand that some of the nerve damage would likely be permanent. The tumor had compressed my spinal cord for too long before the surgery, and nerves didn't always recover completely even after the pressure was removed. Over the next few weeks, Grace worked with me 3 times a week on exercises to rebuild strength and improve my balance. I could walk without help now, but my left leg was weaker than my right, and I still had significant numbness in my foot that made stairs tricky. Some days were better than others. Some days I could do the exercises without much trouble and felt like I was getting back to normal. Other days my leg wouldn't cooperate and I'd get frustrated trying to do simple movements that should have been automatic. During one particularly bad session, I was trying to do single leg stands, and my left leg kept giving out. Grace spotted me each time, but I could feel myself getting more upset with each failed attempt. Finally, I just sat down on the mat and started crying, telling Grace that every struggle reminded me that this damage was completely preventable. If Dr. Brennan had ordered the MRI 8 months ago when I first asked, the tumor would have been smaller, and the surgery would have been simpler, and I wouldn't be sitting here unable to balance on one leg. Grace handed me a water bottle and sat down next to me on the mat. She didn't try to make me feel better or tell me I was doing great. She just listened while I talked about how angry I was. When I finished, she told me she'd treated other patients who were dismissed by doctors before getting proper diagnoses. She'd seen people with MS who were told they were stressed, people with Lyme disease who were told they were depressed, people with autoimmune conditions who were told they needed to exercise more. The medical system had a real problem with dismissing certain patients, especially women with pain that didn't show up on basic tests. Grace suggested I might benefit from therapy to help process the medical trauma alongside the physical recovery, because the emotional damage from being dismissed and disbelieved could be just as hard to heal as the nerve damage in my leg. I took Grace's advice and scheduled an appointment with a therapist the following week. The clinic was in a medical building that smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner, nothing like the hospital antiseptic that still made my stomach turn. The therapist's name was Dr. Reeves, and she specialized in medical trauma according to the website. She had gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and wore regular clothes instead of a white coat, which helped me relax a little. We spent the first session going over what happened with Dr. Brennan, and she listened without interrupting while I explained how he dismissed my symptoms for 8 months until I collapsed. When I finished, she leaned forward and told me something I needed to hear. My anger was completely justified, and processing it didn't mean letting go of accountability. It meant not letting the anger consume me while I healed. She explained that trauma from medical dismissal was real and valid, that being disbelieved by someone who was supposed to help you created a specific kind of wound. Over the next few sessions, she helped me understand that I could be angry about what happened and still move forward with my recovery. The anger didn't have to control every moment of my day. 3 weeks after my surgery, a journalist named Hugo Mendez called my cell phone. He worked for the regional newspaper and wanted to do a story about Dr. Brennan's pattern of dismissing female patients. I told him I needed to talk to my lawyer before agreeing to anything. Jerome called me back within an hour after I left him a message about Hugo's request. He explained that media coverage could help our case by putting public pressure on the hospital, but I needed to be careful about what I said. Anything I told Hugo could potentially be used by the hospital's lawyers, so Jerome wanted to be present during the interview to make sure I didn't accidentally say something that could hurt the lawsuit. I agreed, and Jerome set up a meeting at his office for the following week. When the day came, I drove to Jerome's office building downtown with my husband. The elevator ride made my legs ache because I still couldn't stand for long periods without discomfort. Jerome's office was on the 3rd floor with windows overlooking the street, and Temperance and Millicent were already there when we arrived. Hugo was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with a notebook and recording device set up on Jerome's conference table. Jerome started by explaining the ground rules. We could talk about our experiences with Dr. Brennan and the symptoms he dismissed, but we couldn't discuss specific details about the pending investigation or speculate about the hospital's internal policies. Hugo nodded and started asking questions. We spent 2 hours going through our stories. I talked about the 8 months of appointments where Dr. Brennan refused to order imaging despite my progressive numbness and weakness. Temperance described how he dismissed her joint pain and fatigue as depression, refusing to run autoimmune panels even though lupus ran in her family. Millicent detailed the severe menstrual pain he called normal cramping, never investigating for endometriosis until her ovarian cyst ruptured. Hugo took careful notes and asked follow-up questions about specific appointments, what Dr. Brennan said, how we felt when he dismissed our concerns. By the end, my voice was hoarse from talking, and my leg was throbbing from sitting too long. Hugo's article published the following week with the headline, Pattern of Dismissal, How One Doctor's Bias Left 17 Women Undiagnosed. I bought 3 copies of the newspaper from the convenience store near our house. The article was on the front page of the local section with a photo of the hospital. It included direct quotes from me, Temperance, and Millicent, plus anonymous accounts from 3 other victims who weren't comfortable being named publicly. Hugo had done his research, pulling statistics about how women's pain is systematically undertreated and dismissed compared to men's. He quoted medical studies showing that women wait longer for pain medication in emergency rooms and are more likely to have their symptoms attributed to anxiety or stress. Reading the article made me cry because seeing our experiences validated in print felt important somehow, like proof that what happened to us was real and wrong. The article generated attention around town faster than I expected. My coworkers mentioned seeing it, and several people reached out through social media to share their own stories of medical dismissal. The hospital issued a statement 2 days after publication, expressing regret for the institutional failures that allowed Dr. Brennan's pattern to continue. Their PR response felt hollow and calculated. They talked about implementing new patient complaint tracking systems and reviewing their oversight procedures. But none of that changed the fact that they only acted after my emergency surgery forced their hand. The statement carefully avoided admitting specific wrongdoing while trying to sound concerned and responsible. More women started coming forward after the article published. Some were Dr. Brennan's former patients who hadn't been part of the original 17 cases the hospital identified. Others had similar experiences with different doctors at different hospitals, sharing stories of dismissed pain and refused testing. I created a private social media group for women dealing with medical dismissal, and within a week it had over 40 members. The scope of the problem became clear through their stories. This wasn't about one bad doctor making mistakes. It was about systemic bias and how female patients' pain was treated across the entire medical system. Women with endometriosis told they just had bad periods. Women with autoimmune diseases told they were stressed. Women with heart conditions told they were having panic attacks. The pattern repeated over and over with different doctors in different cities. Jerome filed the class action lawsuit 6 weeks after my surgery. He represented 12 of the 17 women who had serious undiagnosed conditions under Dr. Brennan's care. The 5 women whose tests ultimately came back normal weren't part of the suit, though their experiences of dismissal were equally real and damaging. Jerome explained that the legal standard for malpractice required proving actual harm from the negligence, which meant demonstrating that delayed diagnosis caused worsened outcomes. The 12 of us in the lawsuit all had documented permanent damage or complications that could have been prevented with earlier diagnosis. The lawsuit named both Dr. Brennan and the hospital, alleging medical malpractice and institutional negligence. Jerome held a press conference at his office where several of us spoke about our experiences. I stood at the microphone with my cane for balance and talked about collapsing in the hospital lobby, while Dr. Brennan stepped over me. Temperance described her kidney damage and ongoing dialysis needs. Millicent talked about the infertility caused by untreated endometriosis. Local news cameras recorded everything, and the story got picked up by larger regional media outlets. That evening, I watched myself on the 6 o'clock news talking about how Dr. Brennan refused to order the MRI that would have found my tumor before it caused nerve damage. I was 8 weeks post-surgery when my surgeon cleared me to return to limited activities. My physical recovery had progressed enough that I could walk without assistance, though I still had numbness in my left foot and needed to be careful about balance. Stairs remained tricky, and I got tired faster than before the surgery. Grace said I was doing well considering how close I'd come to permanent paralysis, but some of the nerve damage would likely never fully heal. I started working from home part-time, grateful my employer was flexible about accommodations. Temperance, Millicent, and I started meeting regularly for coffee at a shop near the hospital. We formed an unexpected support group, 3 women connected by the same doctor's negligence. Temperance was struggling the most because her kidney damage required dialysis 3 times a week. She'd been forced to quit her teaching job because she couldn't maintain the energy needed for classroom work while managing her treatment schedule. She talked about being on the transplant waiting list and the uncertainty of not knowing when or if a kidney would become available. Some days she seemed okay, making dark jokes about her dialysis machine. Other days she was quiet and withdrawn, the weight of what Dr. Brennan's dismissal had cost her visible in every movement. Millicent sat across from us at the coffee shop, stirring her tea in slow circles while we waited for her to speak. She'd been quiet since we sat down, different from her usual energy. Finally, she looked up and said she'd been working with a therapist about the infertility, processing what Dr. Brennan's dismissal had stolen from her. The therapy helped most days, she explained, but sometimes she'd see a pregnant woman or a baby announcement, and the rage would hit her so hard she couldn't breathe. She'd lost her chance at biological children because one doctor refused to investigate her pain, and no amount of therapy could give that back. Temperance reached across the table and squeezed her hand without saying anything. Millicent wiped her eyes and mentioned she'd been researching adoption agencies, but every time she started the process, she felt this complicated grief that made it hard to move forward. She wanted to be a mother, but the loss of what was taken kept getting tangled up with thoughts about what could be. I understood that feeling of having something stolen that you could never get back, even if my loss was different from hers. The conversation shifted when Temperance brought up an idea that had been forming in her mind. She asked what we thought about starting some kind of patient advocacy organization focused on medical dismissal of women's pain. The 3 of us had been meeting for weeks, sharing our experiences and supporting each other, and she'd realized how many other women must be going through similar situations without anyone believing them. Millicent nodded slowly and said the idea made sense, but felt overwhelming given that we were all still dealing with our own health problems and recovery. I admitted I'd been thinking about something similar, but didn't know if I had the energy to take on a project like that, while managing my physical therapy and returning to work. We sat there for a while discussing what an organization like that would even look like, what resources it could provide, whether we had the skills or knowledge to make it work. None of us had answers, but the need felt urgent and real. Temperance said she'd been contacted by 2 more women who saw the news coverage and had their own stories of being dismissed by doctors, and if we didn't do something to help, who would? The weight of that responsibility settled over our table like heavy fog. 2 days later, Jerome called me about a development with the lawsuit. The hospital's legal team had reached out to him with settlement discussions, but the approach they were taking raised immediate concerns. They wanted to settle with each plaintiff individually, rather than as a class action, offering separate negotiations with each of the 12 women. Jerome explained this was a standard tactic designed to reduce their total payout and avoid any admission of systemic failure. If they settled with us individually, they could offer different amounts based on severity of harm, pit us against each other over who deserved more, and most importantly avoid making any institutional changes that a class action judgment might force. He asked me to reach out to Temperance and Millicent, so we could discuss this as a group before anyone made decisions. The hospital was counting on some of us accepting quick settlements out of financial need or exhaustion, which would weaken the case for everyone else. I hung up feeling angry that even now, even after everything, the hospital was trying to minimize accountability and avoid real change. We met at Jerome's office 3 days later, all 12 plaintiffs crammed into his conference room. He laid out the situation clearly, and without sugarcoating the difficulty of the choice we faced. Individual settlements would likely be larger for those of us with the most severe outcomes, he explained. My spinal tumor and near paralysis, Temperance's kidney damage requiring dialysis, Millicent's infertility, the woman with undiagnosed MS who now used a wheelchair, we'd probably get substantial compensation if we settled individually. But those individual settlements wouldn't force the hospital to change anything about how they investigate complaints or train doctors about implicit bias. The women with less severe outcomes might get smaller settlements or be pressured to accept minimal amounts. The hospital could write checks, make us sign agreements, and continue operating exactly as they had before. Jerome recommended we reject the individual settlement offers and hold firm on the class action approach, but he made clear this was our decision to make. The room fell silent as we processed what he was telling us. Temperance spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. She said her permanent kidney damage wasn't worth any amount of money, that no settlement could give her back her health or her teaching career or the years she'd lost. But forcing the hospital to change its complaint investigation procedures, making them implement real oversight and training, that might prevent someone else from ending up on dialysis because a doctor dismissed their symptoms. She wanted to reject the individual settlement and continue with the class action, even though it meant more depositions, more stress, more time dragging this out. One by one, the other women voiced their agreement. The woman with MS said she'd rather wait years for a judgment than take money and leave the system unchanged. Millicent said she couldn't live with herself if she took a settlement knowing other women would face the same dismissal she did. When it came to my turn, I thought about collapsing in that hospital lobby, about Dr. Brennan stepping over me like I was trash, about waking up from surgery knowing I'd almost been paralyzed forever. I voted to reject the individual settlements. We all did, unanimously, choosing the harder path because it was the only one that might actually change something. 3 months after my surgery, I returned to work part-time with accommodations for my physical limitations. My employer had been supportive throughout my recovery, allowing me to work from home initially, and then easing back into the office with a modified schedule. But sitting at my desk doing the same tasks I'd done before everything happened felt surreal and disconnected. My coworkers treated me carefully, asking how I was feeling but clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Nobody knew quite what to say to someone who'd almost been paralyzed because their doctor refused to believe them. I'd catch myself touching my left foot during meetings, checking if I could still feel it, remembering how completely numb it had been. The physical therapy had helped tremendously, and I could walk without assistance now, but Grace kept reminding me that some nerve damage would be permanent. I tired faster than before, needed to take breaks to stretch and move, had to be careful about balance. Normal life felt like a costume I was wearing while still processing the trauma of what had happened, like I was pretending everything was fine when nothing felt fine at all. The medical board investigation into Dr. Brennan's license concluded with their formal recommendation for permanent revocation. Jerome called to tell me the news and explained this was actually a strong outcome that we shouldn't take for granted. Medical boards often protected physicians even in cases of clear malpractice, he said, because the boards were made up of other doctors who understood how difficult the job was and tended to give colleagues the benefit of doubt. But the evidence against Dr. Brennan was so overwhelming, the pattern so clear and documented, that the board couldn't ignore it without destroying their own credibility. 17 women with serious undiagnosed conditions, detailed notes showing his dismissive reasoning, multiple complaints filed over years that the hospital had failed to investigate properly. It all added up to a case they couldn't sweep away. Jerome said we should expect Dr. Brennan's attorney to appeal the recommendation, but the permanent revocation would likely stand. I felt a grim satisfaction hearing this, knowing he wouldn't be able to dismiss another woman's pain, but it didn't undo the damage he'd already caused to so many of us. Dr. Brennan's attorney filed motions to dismiss the lawsuit about a week after the medical board recommendation came through. The legal argument claimed that his clinical judgment had been within the standard of care and that bad outcomes didn't necessarily constitute malpractice. Jerome had expected this defense strategy and wasn't concerned about the motion succeeding. He'd already lined up expert witnesses prepared to testify about how refusing diagnostic testing for progressive neurological symptoms violated basic medical standards. A doctor could make a wrong diagnosis and not be liable for malpractice if they'd followed appropriate protocols, Jerome explained. But Dr. Brennan hadn't followed protocols at all. He'd refused to order imaging, dismissed objective findings like absent reflexes, and documented his belief that patients were faking without conducting the tests that would have confirmed or ruled out serious conditions. The expert witnesses would explain to a jury why this wasn't a matter of clinical judgment, but rather a failure to meet minimum standards of care. Jerome seemed confident the motions would be denied, but the legal maneuvering meant more delays, more time before we'd see any resolution. 4 months after my surgery, the hospital's attorneys scheduled my deposition. Jerome prepared me thoroughly over several sessions, explaining what questions to expect and how to answer clearly without getting defensive or emotional. The deposition took place in a sterile conference room at the hospital's legal offices, which felt deliberately hostile given that this was where Dr. Brennan had worked. Their attorneys asked detailed questions about my symptoms, every appointment I'd had with Dr. Brennan, my complete medical history going back years. They wanted to know if I'd ever missed appointments, if I'd always been honest about my symptoms, if I'd done my own research online before seeing Dr. Brennan, if I'd ever asked for pain medication from other doctors. I could see what they were doing, looking for anything they could use to argue I'd contributed to the delayed diagnosis by being a bad historian or a difficult patient. They asked about my work schedule, my stress levels, my relationship with my husband, whether I'd been depressed or anxious. Every question felt designed to suggest I was somehow responsible for Dr. Brennan's failure to diagnose my spinal tumor. The deposition lasted 6 hours with breaks, and by the end I was physically and emotionally exhausted. Jerome had prepared me well, and I'd answered everything honestly and calmly, but having to defend my credibility and justify why I deserved basic diagnostic testing brought back all the helplessness I'd felt in Dr. Brennan's office. The hospital's attorneys had been professional but relentless, circling back to the same questions phrased different ways, trying to catch inconsistencies or admissions they could use. When it finally ended and we left the building, I sat in Jerome's car and cried for 20 minutes while he waited patiently. He told me I'd done well, that my testimony was strong and consistent, that the hospital's tactics were standard, but wouldn't work because the facts were on our side. But I felt like I'd been dismissed all over again, forced to prove I was telling the truth about my own body, required to justify my existence as a patient who deserved care. My husband drove me home in silence after the deposition ended, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. When we got inside, he started pacing back and forth in the living room like a caged animal. He told me the way those lawyers questioned me was disgusting, treating me like I was on trial instead of being the victim. They tried to make me look unreliable by asking about every single appointment I'd ever missed or rescheduled, like missing one follow-up 3 years ago somehow meant I deserved to have a spinal tumor ignored for 8 months. Jerome called that evening to check on me and explained this was standard defense strategy in medical malpractice cases. The hospital's attorneys wanted to make the legal process so miserable and degrading that plaintiffs would give up and accept whatever small settlement was offered just to make it stop. But Jerome said my testimony had been strong and consistent, that I'd handled their tactics well by staying calm and sticking to the facts. He reminded me that juries see through these aggressive defense strategies, especially when the medical evidence is as clear as mine was. The MRI images showing that massive tumor compressing my spinal cord would speak louder than any attempt to paint me as a difficult patient. 5 months after my surgery, Jerome called with unexpected news. The hospital had suddenly shifted their legal strategy and was now proposing mediation for the class action case instead of continuing to fight in court. Jerome explained this usually meant the hospital's legal team had done the math and realized they would lose badly at trial. They wanted to control the narrative and settlement amounts through mediation, rather than letting a jury decide how much money 12 women with permanent injuries deserved. Mediation would let them avoid the public spectacle of a trial, where all the details about Dr. Brennan's pattern would be presented to reporters sitting in the courtroom. Jerome thought we should agree to mediation, but warned us not to accept any settlement that didn't include mandatory changes to how the hospital handled patient complaints. The money mattered for covering medical expenses and compensating us for our suffering, but institutional reforms mattered more for protecting future patients from going through what we did. We met at Jerome's office the following week to discuss what specific policy changes we wanted. All 12 plaintiffs attended along with Jerome and 2 other attorneys from his firm who specialized in institutional reform cases. Jerome had prepared a document outlining potential requirements, including an independent patient complaint tracking system, mandatory implicit bias training for all physicians, and creation of a patient advocacy office with real investigative power. Temperance spoke up first and said the tracking system needed to flag patterns across multiple patients, not just individual complaints. Her lupus diagnosis had been delayed because Dr. Brennan dismissed her symptoms the same way he dismissed mine. But if anyone had been looking at his patient files as a whole, they would have seen he was refusing diagnostic testing for nearly every woman who came to him with chronic pain. Millicent added that the bias training couldn't be some 1-hour online module that doctors clicked through without paying attention. It needed to be comprehensive and taught by experts who understood how gender bias in medicine leads to women dying from preventable conditions. We spent 3 hours developing a detailed list of reforms we would demand during mediation, knowing the hospital would resist anything that required real money and effort to implement. The mediation took place in a hotel conference room over 2 full days, with all 12 of us plaintiffs, our attorneys, the hospital's legal team of 6 lawyers, and a professional mediator who was supposed to be neutral. The hospital's lead attorney opened by presenting their settlement offer, which included financial compensation for each of us based on the severity of our outcomes. The amounts ranged from $50,000 for women whose conditions were caught before permanent damage occurred, up to $500,000 for Temperance whose kidney failure required ongoing dialysis. But when Jerome asked about the institutional reforms we'd outlined, the hospital's attorney said they'd already made adequate changes after firing Dr. Brennan. They'd created a patient complaint form that got filed with the medical director's office, and they'd sent an email to all physicians reminding them about proper diagnostic protocols. Jerome looked at me and the other plaintiffs with an expression that said he'd expected this response. The hospital wanted to throw money at us and pretend the problem was solved by getting rid of one bad doctor, while refusing to acknowledge the systemic failures that let him harm patients for 3 years. Jerome pulled out a thick folder of documents and started walking through the hospital's so-called voluntary reforms, point by point. The patient complaint form they created went to the medical director's office, where it sat in a digital filing system with no process for analyzing patterns across multiple complaints. The email reminder about diagnostic protocols was sent once with no follow-up training, no testing to ensure doctors actually read it, no consequences for physicians who continued ignoring symptoms. Jerome had obtained records through legal discovery showing that in the 6 months since Dr. Brennan's firing, the hospital had received 43 patient complaints about dismissive treatment from other physicians. Not a single one of those complaints triggered any investigation or resulted in any physician being disciplined or required to undergo additional training. The hospital's reforms were window dressing designed to protect them legally without actually changing how they operated. Jerome presented data from medical journals showing that implicit bias training, when done properly by qualified experts over multiple sessions, significantly reduced disparities in how female patients and patients of color receive diagnostic testing. The hospital's refusal to invest in real training showed they cared more about their bottom line than patient safety. Temperance testified during the afternoon session of the first day, and her words cut through all the legal language and bureaucratic excuses. She explained that she'd been a third-grade teacher who loved her job and was good at it, winning Teacher of the Year at her elementary school 2 years before she started seeing Dr. Brennan. Now she couldn't work because dialysis 3 times a week left her exhausted and unable to maintain the energy that teaching young children required. Her kidney damage was permanent and preventable, caused entirely by Dr. Brennan refusing to run basic blood tests that would have caught her lupus before it destroyed her kidneys. She talked about how she'd always wanted to have children, but now that dream was gone because pregnancy would be too dangerous with her kidney function so compromised. The hospital's attorneys looked uncomfortable while she spoke, but as soon as she finished, they went right back to arguing that their settlement offer was generous and fair. One of them actually said that while Temperance's situation was unfortunate, the hospital couldn't be held responsible for one physician's clinical judgment, even if that judgment turned out to be wrong. Jerome interrupted and reminded them this wasn't about one wrong diagnosis, but a documented pattern of refusing to order appropriate tests for female patients over a 3-year period, while the hospital ignored multiple complaints. The first day of mediation ended without any progress, and we all went back to our hotel rooms feeling defeated. The hospital was offering us money, but refusing to implement the meaningful reforms that would actually prevent this from happening to other women. That night, several of us met in Millicent's hotel room to talk about whether we should just take the money and be done with it. The financial settlements would cover our medical expenses and provide some compensation for our pain and suffering. Temperance would get enough money to help with her ongoing dialysis costs and maybe eventually a kidney transplant if she could find a donor. But the institutional changes we'd fought for, the independent patient advocacy office with real investigative power, and the comprehensive bias training for all physicians, those weren't happening. The hospital was willing to make small cosmetic changes while keeping their fundamental systems exactly the same. On the second day of mediation, we reached a complete impasse. The hospital increased their financial offers slightly, but remained firm that they would not create an independent patient advocacy office or mandate comprehensive implicit bias training beyond a basic online module. Their position was that they'd already made adequate reforms, and anything more would be too expensive and burdensome to implement across their entire medical system. We caucused as a plaintiff group in a separate conference room while the mediator shuttled back and forth between us and the hospital's attorneys. Jerome laid out our options clearly. We could accept the financial settlements and basic policy changes the hospital was offering, or we could reject mediation and proceed to trial. The settlements on the table were substantial, enough to make a real difference in all our lives, especially for those of us facing ongoing medical costs. But the institutional changes felt inadequate, like putting a band-aid on a broken system that would keep harming women after we were gone. Jerome reminded us that going to trial was risky and would take at least another year, maybe longer with appeals. We would all have to testify in open court with Dr. Brennan's attorneys cross-examining us and trying to destroy our credibility in front of a jury. Every detail of our medical histories would be examined and questioned. We'd have to relive the trauma of being dismissed and ignored over and over again, through depositions, pre-trial hearings, and finally the trial itself. Jerome believed we would likely win at trial because the evidence was so strong, but the emotional cost would be significant. He'd seen clients win big verdicts only to feel hollowed out by the experience of having their suffering picked apart in public. Several of us were crying as we discussed what to do, torn between accepting an imperfect settlement or fighting for the comprehensive reforms we knew were necessary, but might destroy us emotionally in the process. After 3 hours of difficult discussion, we voted to accept the settlement. The decision wasn't unanimous, and some of us felt like we were giving up. But the majority agreed that the financial compensation combined with the hospital's agreement to implement enhanced complaint tracking and mandatory training on medical bias was meaningful even if it wasn't everything we wanted. The hospital would pay substantial damages to all 12 plaintiffs with amounts based on the severity of our injuries and ongoing medical needs. They would create a centralized complaint tracking system that flagged patterns across multiple patients and required investigation when 3 or more complaints about the same physician were filed within a year. All physicians would be required to complete annual training on implicit bias in clinical settings, though it would only be a 4-hour module instead of the comprehensive multi-session program we'd pushed for. The independent patient advocacy office we wanted wasn't included in the settlement, which felt like the biggest loss. But we were exhausted from fighting, and the hospital had made it clear they would drag this out for years if we didn't accept their terms. As we signed the settlement documents, I felt relief mixed with disappointment, knowing we'd achieved something important, but wondering if it would be enough to actually protect the next woman who walked into that hospital with unexplained pain. The settlement papers arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after they wheeled me into surgery. My husband signed for the package while I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching through the window as leaves fell from the oak tree in our yard. Jerome had called the day before to say everything was finalized, that the money would transfer within 48 hours, but seeing the actual documents made it real in a way his voice on the phone hadn't. I opened the envelope and pulled out the settlement agreement, scanning through pages of legal language until I found the number. It was more money than I'd ever had, more than my parents made in 5 years of working, enough to cover every medical bill and physical therapy session with plenty left over. My husband read over my shoulder and let out a low whistle, but I felt nothing except the familiar numbness in my left foot that reminded me why the money existed in the first place. No amount of compensation could restore full function to my leg or erase the 8 months I spent begging Dr. Brennan to believe me while a tumor grew against my spine. I set the papers down and picked up my coffee, taking a sip while my husband squeezed my shoulder. The money would help, it would make things easier, but it couldn't undo the damage or give back what was lost. Temperance called me 3 days after the settlement cleared, her voice tight with exhaustion from her morning dialysis session. She wanted to meet for lunch to discuss something important, and when Millicent joined us at the cafe downtown, I realized they'd been planning this conversation. Temperance pushed her salad around her plate without eating much, talking about how the settlement money felt like blood money, compensation for permanent damage that never should have happened. Millicent agreed, saying her settlement couldn't buy her the children she'd wanted, couldn't reverse the infertility that Dr. Brennan's dismissal had caused. I listened to them talk about feeling stuck, about having money but no purpose, about wanting to channel their anger into something that might actually help other women. That's when Temperance suggested using part of our settlements to start a nonprofit focused on medical dismissal of women's pain. She'd been researching patient advocacy organizations and found that none specifically addressed the pattern we'd experienced, the systematic way female patients get labeled as dramatic or drug-seeking when they report symptoms doctors can't immediately explain. Millicent pulled out a folder with notes she'd compiled about organizational structure, funding requirements, and mission statements. They'd clearly been working on this together, waiting for the right moment to bring me in. I asked what they envisioned, and Temperance explained she wanted to serve as executive director since her dialysis schedule made returning to teaching impossible, while Millicent and I could join the board and contribute while keeping our jobs. The three of us spent 2 hours mapping out what the organization could do, how it might provide resources for women experiencing medical dismissal, guidance on documenting symptoms and requesting second opinions, strategies for filing effective complaints. By the time we paid the check, we'd committed to pooling portions of our settlements and reaching out to the other plaintiffs to see who else wanted to contribute. The nonprofit paperwork took 3 months to process, but we started building resources immediately. I spent evenings after work creating guides for women on how to document their symptoms in ways doctors couldn't easily dismiss, how to request copies of their medical records, how to find second opinions when their primary doctor refused testing. Millicent used her background in education to develop training modules on implicit bias in clinical settings, working with researchers who'd studied the historical dismissal of women's pain in medical literature. We reached out to medical schools about incorporating our materials into their curriculum, and 2 local programs agreed to pilot the training with their second-year students. Temperance coordinated everything from her home office, building a website where women could access our resources for free and submit their own stories of medical dismissal. Within the first month, we received 43 submissions from women describing experiences similar to ours, doctors who refused to investigate their symptoms, who labeled them as anxious or attention-seeking, who delayed diagnoses that led to permanent complications. Reading their stories felt like looking into mirrors that reflected my own trauma back at me, and some nights I had to step away from the computer, because the weight of how common this pattern was became overwhelming. But seeing the need also reinforced why the organization mattered, why we had to keep building something that might help women navigate a system that still dismissed their pain too often. 9 months after I collapsed on that hospital lobby floor, I walked into our nonprofit's first community workshop without any assistance, just slight numbness in my left foot that I'd learned to compensate for. My husband came with me, helping set up chairs while Temperance tested the microphone, and Millicent arranged handouts on the registration table. 23 women showed up, some with their own stories of medical dismissal, others supporting friends or family members who'd been dismissed. I stood at the front of the room and told my story, starting with the 8 months of begging Dr. Brennan to run tests, and ending with the emergency surgery that saved me from permanent paralysis. Temperance shared about her kidney damage from delayed lupus diagnosis, and Millicent talked about the infertility caused by untreated endometriosis. Then we opened the floor for other women to speak, and what followed was 3 hours of stories that made me grateful for my outcome while breaking my heart for what others had lost. The permanent nerve damage in my foot reminded me daily of what I'd survived and what I'd almost lost, driving me to keep showing up for this work even when it drained me emotionally. My husband and I had grown closer through the trauma, learning to communicate better about pain and fear and anger, and while I'd never be grateful for what happened, I'd found a way to channel the rage into something that might protect future patients. The settlement couldn't undo the damage to me or Temperance or Millicent or the others, couldn't restore what Dr. Brennan's pattern of dismissal had stolen from us, but the policy changes we'd fought for and the advocacy organization we'd built meant his negligence had led to something that might actually help women who came after us, which felt like the only kind of resolution possible when the harm itself could never be reversed.